The moment Wade Mercer told Emily Carter she was just another disposable employee, he was smiling. That was the part she couldn't shake. Not the words, not the cardboard box she carried out of Crestview Medical Center in the rain, but the smile. 48 hours later, classified military files had vanished from a restricted records vault on the hospital's fourth floor. Federal agents were swarming the building, and Mercer was standing in front of cameras pointing directly at her. What nobody in that room knew, what Mercer had spent years making sure nobody would ever know, was that Emily Carter had seen this before. All of it. And the last time they'd buried her for it. If you've made it this far, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story is going to go places you won't see coming. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled. And if this hits you the way I think it will, hit like and follow so you don't miss what comes next. The storm had been building since noon. By the time Emily Carter clocked into her shift at Crestview Medical Center, the sky over Harlow, Montana had turned the color of old bruises, greenish-gray, heavy with something that hadn't broken yet. She parked in the staff lot and sat in her car for a moment, watching a plastic bag spiral up toward the light poles. Her coffee was still hot. She drank the last of it, crushed the cup, and got out. Crestview wasn't a big hospital. It served a mid-sized city that sat in the middle of nowhere between two mountain ranges, a place people ended up rather than chose. The facility had 3 wings, a Level 3 trauma center, and a contract with a nearby military installation called Fort Aldrich that brought in additional federal funding, and occasionally additional complications. Emily had been working there for 14 months, long enough to know the good nurses from the ones who disappeared at shift change. Long enough to know that Ward Administrator Lieutenant Wade Mercer, whose title never quite made sense to anyone because he was simultaneously a hospital administrator and an active-duty liaison officer for the Fort Aldrich contract, had a habit of walking the 4th floor after hours. She hadn't said anything about it, not yet. Emily Carter was 37 years old. She was white, medium height, with the kind of posture that came from years of standing at attention, something she'd mostly trained herself out of, though it returned when she was tired or stressed. She'd done 2 tours as an Army combat nurse, one in a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, one at a field hospital in northern Iraq. She'd left the service 6 years ago under circumstances she didn't discuss, and she had rebuilt her life with the particular patience of someone who understood that rebuilding was not the same as recovering. She was good at her job. She was precise and fast, and she didn't waste motion. The other nurses liked her well enough, though she kept a distance that some read as coldness and others read as professionalism. The truth was somewhere adjacent to both. She had learned, somewhere between her first tour and her second, that the people who got too close to you were the people whose faces you saw later when you were trying to sleep. She took the staff elevator to the 3rd floor, changed into scrubs, and started her rounds. The 4th floor was above her, technically out of her jurisdiction. It housed administrative offices, record storage, and a wing that had been converted to house the Fort Aldrich liaison office, a small suite of rooms with reinforced doors and a keycard access system that had been installed 2 years prior. The nurses called it the quiet floor. You didn't go up there unless you had a reason. At 7:14 p.m., Emily had a reason. She'd taken a wrong turn coming back from the supply closet, or what she'd thought was the supply closet. She'd mixed up the stairwell exits, something she hadn't done in months, and attributed to the headache that had been sitting behind her left eye since she'd gotten in that morning. She pushed through a door and found herself in a corridor she recognized as the quiet floor by the change in lighting. Fluorescence here instead of the warmer overhead panels on the floors below, a colder, more institutional quality to the air. She turned to go back. That was when she saw the door. The restricted records office was at the end of the corridor, a room she'd walked past exactly twice in 14 months, both times with Mercer or another administrator, never alone. The door was supposed to be sealed. There was a keycard reader on the wall beside it and a secondary combination panel below that. Both were supposed to require simultaneous authorization. The door was standing open 3 inches. She stopped. There was no alarm, no sound. The corridor was empty except for the low hum of the HVAC system, and now that she was paying attention, a faint shuffle from inside the room, paper maybe, or a hard drive being pulled from a slot. something deliberate and careful and quiet. Emily stood there for what was probably 5 seconds, but felt much longer. She was doing a calculation that she'd done before, in different corridors, in different buildings, in a part of her life she had spent 6 years trying to put behind a closed door of its own. The calculation went like this. You could keep walking, and whatever was happening would keep happening, and you would never have to be responsible for what came next. Or you could not keep walking. She didn't keep walking. She took out her phone. Against protocol to have it on the floor, she'd been warned twice, she was aware, and she held it against her side as she moved to the door. She didn't push it open. She angled herself to see through the gap. Inside, a figure in dark clothing was at the filing cabinet at the far wall. He was removing folders, manila folders with the red-banded security headers she'd seen from a distance before, and sliding them into a flat carrier case. He was fast, efficient. He'd done this before or had practiced. The room's internal camera, she could see it in the upper corner, had its red indicator light off, which meant either it had been disabled or someone with access had switched it to inactive mode. The second option required credentials she didn't have, and as far as she knew, most of the regular staff didn't have either. She stepped back. She walked, not ran, back to the stairwell, took it down to the 3rd floor, and went to the nurse's station. There was nobody there she wanted to talk to. Franny Dobbs was on her phone, and Marcus Yee had disappeared somewhere, so she went straight to the wall-mounted house phone and called administration. Mercer answered on the 2nd ring. Lieutenant Mercer, this is Emily Carter, 3rd floor RN. I need to report something. There's someone in the restricted records office on 4. The door was open, and Carter. He cut her off without any particular urgency. That floor is under scheduled maintenance review tonight. I didn't see any maintenance crew. This was scheduled maintenance review. He enunciated each word with the practiced patience of a man who had long since stopped believing that patience was actually necessary. Is there anything else? She held the phone for a moment. The camera light was off. Cameras get switched off during equipment reviews, standard procedure. A pause. Is there something else you needed, or are we done? I know what I saw, and I'm sure it was very concerning. Now there was something else in his voice, not irritation exactly, but its older cousin, something adjacent to warning. Go back to your floor, Carter. Your shift ends at 11. She hung up. She went back to her floor, but she didn't stop thinking about it. Mercer came to find her at 9:30. She was charting at the nurse's station when she heard his footsteps. She recognized them, the particular cadence of a man who wore dress shoes on linoleum and didn't care how much noise they made. She looked up when he came around the corner, and he was already wearing an expression she didn't trust, friendly in the way that certain animals are friendly before they decide you're not worth the effort. He was a few years older than her, trim, in the way that came from discipline rather than metabolism, with short salt and pepper hair and a face that had been conventionally attractive once, and now was something else, authority-shaped, she thought. Everything about him communicated rank, even when he wasn't technically in uniform. Walk with me, he said. It wasn't a question. She walked with him. He took her to a small conference room off the main corridor, the kind used for staff reviews and the occasional family meeting when the news wasn't good. He closed the door. He didn't sit. I'm going to be direct with you, he said, which was something people said when they had already decided not to be. What you did tonight, going up to 4, inserting yourself into a situation you have no context for, that's a problem. I made a phone call. I reported something I observed. You accessed a restricted floor without authorization. I got off on the wrong exit. I didn't access anything. He tilted his head slightly. The camera footage will show where you were and what you touched. I didn't touch anything. She kept her voice even. She had a lot of practice keeping her voice even. I looked through a door that was already open and I called administration. That's it. Right. He nodded slowly, like she'd said something that confirmed something else. And before I go into what happens next, I want to be clear about something. This isn't personal. You're a competent nurse. Your patient outcomes are fine. But this organization has a specific culture of discretion around our Fort Aldrich contract. And when someone on my staff, someone who's been here 14 months, and doesn't have the context to understand what she's looking at, starts reporting activity on floors she has no business being on, it creates problems. He paused. It creates problems for the hospital, and by extension, it creates problems for you. Emily looked at him. I reported a security concern through the appropriate channel, to you, and I addressed it. You told me it was maintenance. It was. She didn't say anything. Here's what I need you to understand. He moved to the other side of the table, not aggressive, just repositioning, the way a person does when they want to change the angle of a conversation. You're a good employee in a role that hundreds of nurses in this state would take tomorrow. That's not a threat. That's context. This institution has invested in you. I'd hate to see that investment end badly. He said it with a warmth that made her skin feel tight. So let's just agree that what you saw tonight was maintenance activity, and we move on. She held his gaze for a moment. Sure, she said. It was the most useful lie she had available to her. She was fired at 11:15 a.m. the following morning. The termination notice cited failure to maintain professional boundaries and unauthorized access to restricted facility areas, and creating a hostile work environment through repeated unfounded accusations against administrative staff. The last one was interesting because she had made exactly one phone call to one person about one thing the night before, but by morning it had become repeated and unfounded and aimed at administrative staff, plural, a small but telling inflation of the record. HR handled it. They were apologetic in the procedural way that HR is always apologetic, the way that makes clear that the apology is performance and the decision is final. She was given 2 weeks severance, a cardboard box, and an escort to the elevator. As she waited for the elevator, box in her arms, Marcus Yee came around the corner and saw her. He stopped. He looked at the box. He looked at her face. Emily, it's fine, she said. Take care of yourself, Marcus. The elevator opened. She got in. The storm had broken overnight and left the parking lot gleaming. The mountains to the west still clouded, but the sky above the city a hard, washed blue. She put the box in her trunk and sat in her car and did not cry, because she had used up a significant portion of her capacity for that particular response approximately 6 years ago, and what remained she rationed carefully. She thought about calling someone. She didn't have many options. Her sister in Vermont, who would be sympathetic and would ask the wrong questions. A former colleague from her army days who had since moved to Germany. Neither felt right. She started the car. She had gotten 3 blocks when the emergency broadcast system came through on the radio. She turned up the volume. A security incident at Crestview Medical Center. All non-essential personnel directed to leave the building, law enforcement responding. She pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat with the engine running. Not maintenance, she thought. By evening, what had happened was public enough to piece together an outline. Classified files had gone missing from the Restricted Records Office on the 4th floor of Crestview Medical Center. Federal investigators had been called. The hospital was cooperating with authorities. The incident was being treated as a potential breach of sensitive military information related to the Fort Aldrich contract. The next morning, Emily's name appeared in a local news report. A source, unnamed, described only as a senior hospital administrator, had indicated that investigators were looking at a recently terminated employee who had been found in the restricted area the night the files disappeared. The report was careful with its language. She had not been charged. She was not officially a suspect, but the implication sat there in the middle of the paragraph like a stone in a stream, redirecting everything around it. Her phone started getting calls from numbers she didn't recognize, which she didn't answer. She got a call from Franny Dobbs, who she did answer. "I'm sorry," Franny said, and the way she said it made clear she believed the report. "I didn't take anything," Emily said. "I know." Franny said it the way people say I know when they don't know and also don't want to be the one holding the uncertainty. "I'm sure it'll get sorted out." It wouldn't get sorted out by itself. Emily understood that clearly. She'd understood it before, in a different context, when she was younger and more willing to believe that the right outcome arrived naturally if you waited long enough. She had waited. The right outcome had not arrived. She had learned the lesson in the way that costs something and doesn't come back. She sat at her kitchen table in the apartment she'd rented month to month since arriving in Harlow, and she thought about what she had. She had her nursing license, which the hospital couldn't revoke unilaterally. She had her discharge papers from the Army buried in a storage folder she hadn't opened in 3 years. She had the memory of what she'd seen through that 3-inch gap in the door. And she had the certainty, not hope, not suspicion, certainty, that whoever had been in that room was not a maintenance crew. She made a list of what she needed to do. She was on the 3rd item when her phone rang again. Unknown number. She stared at it. It rang 5 times. She picked up. "Ms. Carter," a man's voice, controlled, deliberate, the particular flatness of someone trained to deliver information without inflection. "My name is not something I'm going to give you over the phone. I'll tell you this. I've been trying to locate you for a while. The incident at Crestview accelerated my timeline. I need you to stay in Harlow. Don't go anywhere. Can you do that?" She stared at the far wall of her kitchen. The paint was slightly off-white, marked with a small water stain near the window she'd never bothered to report. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who knows what happened 6 years ago," he said. "And someone who knows it wasn't over." The line went dead. She set the phone down on the table. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the storm window she'd been meaning to fix since September. She looked at her list. She looked at the phone. She thought about 6 years ago. She thought about the report she'd filed, and the inquiry that followed, and the inquiry that ended without findings, and the transfer that came 3 weeks after that, and the medical discharge that came 3 months after the transfer, with documentation citing stress-related performance concerns that she'd never seen in any evaluation prior. She thought about the names she'd found in the financial records she'd been asked to cross-reference during a routine audit, a name that had no business appearing in those records, and the supervisor who had taken the printout from her hands and told her she'd misread it and sent her back to her unit. She had not misread it. She had known, from the moment she'd been separated from service, that someone had made a decision to make her go away quietly. She had spent 6 years being quiet. She had rebuilt her life with careful, patient discipline, the way you rebuild anything structural, from the foundation, without shortcuts. She had come to Harlow because nobody knew her there. She had taken the job at Crestview because it paid well, and the trauma volume was manageable, and she was trying, consciously and deliberately, to be a person again rather than a former person. And now this. She picked the phone back up and looked at the dead screen for a moment. Then the scanner app she kept on her phone, a habit from her Army days she'd never quite abandoned, lit up with traffic from the emergency services channel. She turned the volume up. Multiple casualties reported. Military helicopter, engine failure in storm conditions, crash landing approximately 9 miles northwest of Harlow city limits. At least 7 injured, 2 critical. Nearest trauma facility, Crestview Medical Center. She was already standing up. She told herself she was going because she was a nurse, and there were hurt people, and that was the only relevant fact. She told herself this with enough conviction that she almost believed it. She grabbed her jacket and her keys. The sky to the northwest had gone dark again, thick with a second system rolling in off the mountains, and she could see the distant strobe of emergency lights already moving along the highway as she pulled out of her parking lot. The wind hit her car broadside at the first intersection, hard enough to rock it on its springs. She drove toward it. By the time she reached the hospital, the ambulances had already started arriving. She could see them from the street, 3 units at the bay, a 4th coming in hot, and a state police cruiser blocking the main entrance. There was a cluster of staff outside in the wind, which meant internal organization had broken down, which meant the receiving team was overwhelmed. She parked on the street, pulled her hospital ID badge from her jacket pocket, the one they hadn't collected because nobody had thought to ask for it back, and walked toward the bay. A security guard she didn't recognize put a hand up. "Hospital personnel only." She held up the badge. "I'm RN Carter, 3rd floor." He looked at the badge. He looked at her. He was young, maybe 24, and behind him she could hear someone shouting about a BP that was dropping and a second voice calling for a crash cart. He stepped aside. She went in. The receiving area was organized the way a room becomes disorganized when everyone in it is doing something different, and the person who's supposed to be running it hasn't arrived yet. She counted 3 gurneys, 2 techs, 1 resident she recognized, Dr. Alec Moss, good doctor, bad under pressure. And 4 nurses, all moving, none of them in any particular coordination with the others. "What's the count?" she called. Moss looked up. His face cycled through recognition, confusion, and relief in about 2 seconds. 7 incoming, 2 critical, one's got a chest wound we're not prepared for, and radiology is backed up. Start triage. Who's the most critical? She'd already moved to the nearest gurney where a young man in uniform, late 20s, airman by the look of his flight suit, had a field dressing on his left thigh that had soaked through. "Chest wound, second bay," Moss said. "Who's on it?" "Kavinsky." "Put Kavinsky on the thigh bleeder. She's got the hands for it." "Where's your attending?" "Called in from the parking garage, 2 minutes out." "You have 2 minutes of patience right now. Move." She was already at the second bay, pulling on gloves from the box on the cart, and the nurse there, a woman named Petra she'd worked with twice, stepped back slightly without being asked, reading the situation in the way that good nurses do. The airman in the second bay was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the color of someone whose pressure was falling. There was a wound to his left chest she didn't like. Entrance point below the clavicle, the kind of injury that could be lung or could be cardiac, or could be both and meant trouble either way. His oxygen sat read 88 and dropping. She started talking to him while she worked. "Stay with me. What's your name?" "Vasquez." His voice was tight, controlled, military training holding the pain at arm's length, but barely. "Vasquez, I'm Emily. This is going to be uncomfortable." She was already positioning for a needle decompression, calling for the equipment, and Petra had it ready before she finished the sentence. "Can you feel your fingers?" "Yeah." "Good sign. Count to 10 for me. Keep your eyes open." He started counting. She worked. The next 40 minutes were the kind she hadn't had in 6 years. Not frantic, not chaotic, but fully occupied, every part of her attention engaged with a problem that was concrete and solvable and right in front of her. She coordinated the intake on 4 of the 7 casualties, assisted on a procedure she wasn't technically authorized to perform but did anyway, because the alternative was worse, and redirected 3 staff members who had stopped being effective through no fault of their own, except that nobody had told them what to do. Dr. Mina Storch, the trauma attending, arrived 7 minutes in and took command immediately, which was the right call, and spent about 30 seconds assessing what Emily was doing before simply integrating her into the response rather than stopping to ask questions. At one point, Storch looked at her across a gurney and said, "Where did you train?" "Fort Ramsey Combat Trauma Unit, and a FOB in Kandahar for about 8 months." Storch didn't say anything else. She just nodded and kept working. When the last of the critical patients had been stabilized and moved to the ICU, Emily stepped back and took a breath and became aware of her surroundings again in a way she hadn't been for the last 40 minutes. The bay had quieted. 2 nurses were cleaning. The wind was still going outside, audible through the walls. Her hands were steady, which she noticed only because she'd half expected them not to be. She was stripping off her gloves when she heard the doors. She turned. A man came through the bay entrance. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of build that had been athletic once, and now was something more considered. Still solid, still deliberate, but the urgency had settled into patience. He walked with a slight hitch in his right step that she recognized as an old injury compensated for rather than treated. He was in civilian clothes, canvas jacket, boots, dark cargo pants, but everything about his bearing said otherwise. He was scanning the room, and when his eyes found her, they stopped. He walked toward her with the directness of someone who had been looking for a specific thing and had found it. "Emily Carter," he said. Not a question. She looked at him. "You're the one who called." "Commander Logan Reed," he said. "Retired Navy SEAL." He extended his hand. His grip was what she expected. "We need to talk, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to change the last 6 years." Behind him, through the bay doors, she could see the lights of additional vehicles arriving. More federal, she thought, by the look of the plates. And the rain had started again, hard and sideways, hammering the concrete outside. She looked at Reed. 6 years ago, she said, I found a name in a set of financial records I wasn't supposed to see. His expression shifted by a fraction. That name, she continued, turned up in a security breach last night. On a restricted floor of this hospital, I saw who was in that room. She paused. I've been waiting 6 years to say this to someone who already knows what it means. Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked over his shoulder at the arriving vehicles. When he turned back, whatever caution had been in his face had been replaced by something else. The files that went missing, he said, weren't just Crestview records. The lights outside multiplied. A figure in a dark jacket with a federal shield on his belt was already crossing toward the entrance. Mercer, Emily said. Reed nodded once. We know, he said. Reed didn't have time to say anything more before the federal agent came through the doors. He was mid-40s, compact, with the kind of face that stayed neutral regardless of what was happening. A practiced neutrality that Emily recognized as investigative training, the deliberate suppression of readable response. He had a badge on his belt and a tablet in his hand, and he moved through the bay like someone who'd already memorized the floor plan. Special Agent Dorian Holt, FBI Field Office. He looked at Reed first, then at Emily. You're Carter. Yes. I need 10 minutes with you. Reed started to say something. Holt looked at him. Commander Reed, we appreciate your cooperation up to this point. Ms. Carter comes with me. The way Reed's jaw moved told Emily that he and Holt had already had at least one version of this conversation, and it hadn't gone well for either of them. But Reed stepped back. He caught her eye as she passed him and gave her a single small nod that said, Don't volunteer anything you don't have to. She went with Holt. He took her to a room off the main corridor, some small, no windows, the kind of neutral institutional space that hospitals keep for purposes that require privacy. A conference table with 4 chairs. Can you give me anything more specific? Build, movement pattern, anything? Medium height, the movement was practiced. He wasn't looking around the way someone nervous looks around. He knew exactly where the files were. She paused. And he knew the camera was off before he walked in. Holt wrote something on the tablet with a stylus. You told Mercer. I called administration. He answered. And his response. He told me it was maintenance. When I pushed back, he told me the cameras are disabled during equipment reviews. She looked at Holt steadily. I've been in that hospital for 14 months. There's never been a scheduled maintenance review on the 4th floor during an evening shift. Holt looked at her. You know that for a fact? I know my shift patterns. I know the building's maintenance schedule because I served on the facilities advisory committee for 6 months when they were renovating the East Wing. No, there was no scheduled review. He wrote something else. Then, Ms. Carter, your Army service. She'd been expecting it. What about it? Medical discharge 2019. Reason cited was stress-related performance impairment. That was the reason cited. Was it accurate? She looked at the whiteboard with its ghost lines. No. Tell me what was accurate. She looked back at him. I think you already know. He held her gaze. I'd like to hear it from you. So she told him. Not everything. There wasn't time for everything, and she didn't know yet how much she trusted him, how much she trusted any of this. But the core of it, the financial audit cross-referencing she'd been assigned in the spring of 2019, the anomalous contractor payments she'd flagged, the name that had appeared in the disbursement records that shouldn't have been there, the supervisor who had taken the printout, the inquiry that went nowhere, the transfer, the discharge. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the building's HVAC system and the distant sound of rain on the exterior walls. Holt looked at his tablet. He turned it so she could see the screen. It was a scanned document, financial records, the kind she recognized immediately because she'd spent 3 days staring at their predecessors 6 years ago. At the bottom of the 3rd column, a name. Her eyes went to it before she could stop them. Mercer, W.T. Those are the files from the 4th floor, she said. Part of them. We recovered a portion before the removal was complete. Someone left faster than they'd planned. Holt turned the tablet back. The name you found 6 years ago? Mercer, she said. It was Mercer then, too. Holt nodded once. We know. We've known for approximately 8 months that Lieutenant Mercer was a node in a larger network. We didn't know what he was moving or where the access point was until last night. She absorbed this. You knew for 8 months. Building a case takes time. I was fired yesterday morning. She said it without heat, but clearly, based on his account. Holt's expression shifted just slightly, something that might have been discomfort if he let it be. I understand that. No, she said. I don't think you do, but we can come back to that. She stood up. He didn't stop her. I'll need you available, he said. I'll be available. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Agent Holt, the person I saw in that room. Mercer's still in this building, isn't he? Holt looked at her for a beat too long to mean anything good. We're managing that situation. She left before she said something that would make the next part harder. Reed was waiting in the corridor outside. He fell into step beside her without asking, which she didn't mind. How'd it go? He's competent, she said. What's he not telling me? Reed's mouth compressed. They've had eyes on Mercer for 8 months. The plan was to let him move the files and trace the network. When the breach was discovered last night, before Mercer could complete the transfer, it forced them to accelerate. So they needed the files to move. Needed to know where they went. The files themselves aren't the point. It's the destination that unravels the rest of the network. He paused. Mercer panicked when the alarm tripped. Didn't get out clean. A portion of what he took was recovered in a bag in the maintenance corridor on sublevel 2. Emily stopped walking. He's been here all night. Building's been on soft lockdown since 2 a.m. Nobody announced it publicly because they didn't want him moving again until they were positioned. Reed looked down the corridor, then back at her. The helicopter crash complicated things. You complicated things. I complicated things. The staff response, the casualties, it shifted resources. Mercer's been watching it all. He's smart enough to know that a building full of federal agents in a trauma response is a building where a lot of doors are opening and closing. Reed's voice was level. They think he's still inside. They're not certain. She stood there in the corridor for a moment, processing the specific wrongness of the situation. That the man who had walked her out of this building with a cardboard box, who had called her a disposable employee with a smile, who had spent the last 20 hours reframing her as a suspect, was somewhere in this building right now, watching the federal response and calculating his exit. 6 years ago, she said, when I filed the report. How far up did it go? Reed looked at her. Far enough that you needed to disappear. Mercer wasn't acting alone then. No. And now? The network is larger than what we had in 2019. It grew while you were gone. He said it without cruelty, but it landed with weight. The files he was trying to move, they document contractor payments routed through shell companies, military procurement falsifications, and intelligence data that was sold to a private defense consulting firm that nobody has been able to fully identify yet. This isn't one corrupt officer. This is infrastructure. She thought about that word, infrastructure. The way a system sustains itself not through the actions of any one person, but through the accumulated weight of a lot of people making a lot of small decisions that individually look like nothing. What do you need from me? She said. Right now, stay visible. Stay in the building. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite apology, but was adjacent to it. I know that's not nothing to ask. No, she said. It's not. But she stayed. She found Petra in the break room at midnight, both of them holding terrible vending machine coffee that neither of them was actually drinking. Petra was a few years younger than Emily, Filipino-American, with the dark-eyed steadiness of someone who'd processed enough hospital trauma to have stopped being surprised by it and hadn't yet reached the point of being deadened by it. She was a good nurse. She'd handed Emily the decompression needle without being asked, and that was the kind of competence you didn't forget. You didn't have to stay, Petra said. I know. They're saying you took the files. I didn't. Petra looked at her coffee cup. I know you didn't. She said it without the Franny Dobbs hedge, the I'm sure it'll work out caveat. She said it flat, like a fact she'd already verified. Mercer's been wrong about things before. He fired Lucinda Park last spring for something that turned out to be a billing software error. Never apologized. She paused. What's actually going on? Emily looked at her. She made a decision, the kind that's less a decision than an acknowledgement of what's already true. More than a filing error, she said. A lot more. Petra nodded slowly. The federal agents. Yeah. And you're in the middle of it. I've been in the middle of it for 6 years. I just didn't know it was still going. Petra absorbed this without flinching, which Emily filed away as a data point about her character. What do you need? It was the second time someone had asked her that tonight, and both times it had caught her slightly off balance because for 6 years the question had not been what she needed, but what she could do without. Right now, nothing, but stay close to your phone. Petra stood up. You stabilized Vasquez, she said. That chest wound would have dropped him in another 4 minutes. Moss wasn't ready for it. She paused at the door. Whatever they're saying about you, the people in this trauma bay tonight know what they saw. She left. Emily sat alone with her terrible coffee and the particular silence of a hospital after midnight. Not quiet, never quiet, but a different register of sound. Monitors, ventilation, the soft footsteps of the night staff. She had worked enough night shifts to have stopped being unnerved by that silence years ago, but tonight it felt different, charged, like the hour before a weather system arrived. She was thinking about the documents, specifically about what Reed had said. The files documented contractor payments and intelligence data sold to an unidentified private defense consulting firm. She had been a combat nurse, not an intelligence officer. But she'd spent enough time in forward operating bases to understand what the sale of sensitive military data meant in practical terms. Not as an abstraction, not as a policy problem, but as a thing that got people killed in specific places by specific means. She set her coffee cup down. She took out her phone and looked at the number Reed had called from. She sent a text. What firm? 3 minutes passed. Then, Helion Group, ring any bells? She stared at the name. It did ring a bell. A faint one, like something you hear in another room and aren't sure you heard at all. She went back through her memory of 2019, the financial records, the anomalous payments, the disbursement lines that didn't match any contractor she recognized from the base operational roster. There had been one line item that her supervisor had particularly wanted her to move past. She hadn't written it down. She hadn't been able to write it down. But she remembered it the way you remember the specific wrong note in a piece of music, a company name abbreviated that she'd read as HLN Group, Helion Group. She sat very still. This was not a coincidence. The thing about conspiracies, the real ones, not the Baroque architecture of fiction, but the actual operational kind, was that they weren't complicated. They were simple, and they repeated themselves because the people running them were not creative. They were careful and they were protected and they were patient, but they weren't creative. They found something that worked and they kept using it until something stopped them. Nothing had stopped them in 2019 because she had been stopped first. She typed back. I saw that name in 2019, in the disbursement records, before the printout was taken. A pause. Then, that's what we needed to confirm. Don't go anywhere. She wasn't going anywhere. She was sitting in a hospital break room in the middle of the night. Fired, facing a leak to the press that made her look like a thief, connected to a federal investigation that 8 hours ago she hadn't known existed, and the man responsible for most of it was somewhere in this building. She thought about the 4th floor. She thought about the maintenance corridor on sublevel 2 where the recovered bag had been found. She thought about Mercer in the conference room, explaining to her with that administrative warmth that she was disposable, that the institution had invested in her, that she should be grateful for the context. She thought about the smile. Her phone buzzed. Not a text. The emergency notification system, the internal hospital channel. She read it twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Code Gray. Sublevel 2. Security to respond immediately. Code Gray meant combative individual. It was the code they used when someone was being physically threatening or had breached a secured area. Sublevel 2 was where the maintenance corridor was, where the bag had been recovered, where the recovery team had presumably gone after, looking for what else might have been stashed there. She was already moving before she'd fully processed the decision to move. The stairwell was empty. She took the stairs 2 at a time down past the ground floor into the sublevel, a lower register of sound here, the building's mechanical infrastructure, pipes, the pressure hum of the HVAC compressors, the distant sound of a generator, fluorescent tubes overhead, some of them flickering at the far end where the maintenance equipment was stored. She came around the corner and stopped. There were 2 federal agents in the corridor, both of them with their hands raised in a posture she recognized, not threatening but not relaxed, facing a door at the end of the hall. The door was a maintenance access point, old, painted the same gray-green as the walls, with a push-bar mechanism instead of a handle. It was pushed open 6 inches. Holt was at the near end of the corridor, phone to his ear, speaking quietly. He saw her. He held up a hand. Stop. She stopped. She heard, through the door, through the 6-inch gap, the sound of someone moving fast on gravel or packed earth outside the building. A tunnel exit, she realized. The maintenance access connected to the utility tunnel that ran under the hospital's parking structure, which meant there was an exit point somewhere on the north side of the building, which meant... Holt said something into his phone. His voice dropped too low for her to catch. Then he lowered the phone, looked at her, and in his very controlled, very neutral face, she saw something that was not controlled at all. He's out, Holt said. She looked at the door, at the gap, at the dark line of the outside, the cold air coming through it, the sound of the rain on the ground beyond. No, said a voice from outside the door. A different voice, clipped, calm, familiar in a way that Emily couldn't immediately place. Then the door opened fully. Standing in the frame, in the rain, with water on his jacket and his boots muddy from the ground outside the exit, was Commander Reed. Behind him, visible in the gray light of the tunnel exit, were 3 men she didn't recognize, large, in dark tactical gear, standing in a loose formation around a figure who had his wrists in flex cuffs and whose dress shoes were caked with mud, and whose face, when he turned it toward the light, was the face she had been looking at across a conference room table 36 hours ago. Wade Mercer looked at her. The smile was gone. In its place was something she had not expected. Not rage, not contempt, but something that looked, in the unflattering fluorescent light of the sublevel corridor, like the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the person he wrote off as disposable was the one loose end he should have pulled tighter. Reed looked at Holt. North exit, just like you thought. His voice was completely even. Waiting party of 4. Holt exhaled through his nose, a short sound that wasn't quite relief but was close. He holstered his phone. Emily looked at Mercer. He was looking back at her, and for a moment the corridor was very quiet except for the rain and the mechanical hum of the building and the sound of her own pulse, which she could feel in the base of her throat. "Miss Carter," Mercer said. His voice was controlled, still. That administrative register, that management of the room quality that had worked for him for a very long time in a lot of rooms. "I want you to know this is not—" "Don't," Reed said. Not loud, not aggressive, just final. Mercer stopped. Holt stepped forward and took his arm and began moving him down the corridor toward the stairwell. And as he passed Emily, he kept his eyes forward, and she watched him go with the particular sensation of watching something you have been carrying for a long time become someone else's weight. But even as she watched, even as Reed came to stand beside her in the corridor, and the agents began securing the access door and Holt disappeared around the corner with Mercer in front of him, something was working at the back of her mind. A number, a detail. Reed had said, waiting party of 4. There were 3 men in tactical gear at the north exit. Reed. That was 4. She turned to Reed. "How did you know to go to the north exit?" Reed looked at her. "We had the tunnel map from the building plans," he said. "There are 2 exits. South was covered. North was the logical route." "Right." She was nodding, but her mind was going somewhere else. "And Mercer went north." "Correct." "How did Mercer know the south exit was covered?" Reed went still. It was a small stillness, a half second, barely visible, but she'd spent enough time around people trained to conceal reaction that she could read its edges. "He didn't go south," Reed said carefully. "He went north." "Right," she said again. "He chose north. Not randomly. He chose it." She looked at the maintenance door, still slightly ajar, the cold air coming through. Someone told him which way to go. The corridor felt very still suddenly. The generator hum. The rain. Reed looking at her with an expression she couldn't yet parse. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She answered it. There was no voice on the other end. There was a sound, paper or clothing or something being handled, and then a click, and then a second voice, not on the phone, but audible through the phone. A voice she recognized, Holt's voice, saying a name she'd never heard, and a number that sounded like an account number or a code, and then silence. She lowered the phone slowly. Reed was watching her face. "What?" he said. She looked at him. "We have a problem," she said. Reed didn't ask her to explain twice. She played it back to him. Not the recording, she hadn't recorded it, just the account. Holt's voice, the name she didn't recognize, the number sequence. Reed's face stayed controlled, but his eyes were doing something else, working through implications the way a man does when he's triangulating a situation that just got significantly worse. "Say the name again," he said. She said it. Reed turned away from her, took 3 steps down the corridor, stopped. She watched his shoulders settle. Not the relaxation of relief, but the specific physical adjustment of someone choosing to be operational instead of reactive. "Calloway," he said, half to himself. "You know it." It's a name that showed up twice in the Helion Group financial trace. We thought it was a shell entity, a holding name for a corporate structure. He turned back to her. "Not a person." "It's a person," she said. Holt was talking to a person. Reed looked at the ceiling for a moment. The fluorescent light above them was doing its intermittent flicker, and in the uneven light his expression was hard to read, but she caught enough of it. The calculation, the recalibration, the particular fatigue of someone who has been building something for months and just found out the foundation has a crack. If Holt is Calloway, he said, or if Holt is reporting to Calloway, then Mercer walking into a waiting party at the north exit was not an accident, she finished. He was supposed to get out. The arrest was theater. Reed looked at her. The recovery team on sub-level 2, before the code gray. Who called the code gray? His jaw tightened. I don't know. They stood in the flickering corridor with the rain outside and the weight of what they were saying settling between them like something physical. She could feel it. The specific vertigo of a situation expanding past the frame you thought contained it. She'd felt it once before, in 2019, sitting at a desk in a forward support base with a printout in her hands and the slow, cold understanding arriving that the anomaly she'd found was not a clerical error. "We can't go to Holt," she said. "No." "Who do you trust in the federal response?" Reed thought for 2 seconds. "Vasquez," he said. "The casualty you stabilized. He's not FBI. He's a warrant officer with the Army Criminal Investigation Division. He was on that helicopter for a reason." He looked at her. "He's been working a parallel track on the Helion Group for 4 months, separately from Holt's operation. They weren't supposed to overlap tonight." She absorbed this. "He's in the ICU. He was conscious 40 minutes ago. I checked." She made the decision in the time it took to take a breath. "Take me up." The ICU night staff knew her, which helped. Petra was the one on rotation, and when Emily came through the unit doors with Reed behind her, Petra looked at both of them, looked at the corridor behind them, and said nothing except, "Bay 4. He's been asking for water every 20 minutes. I think he's stalling." Vasquez was sitting up at a 30-degree incline, which was about as far as the chest wound was going to allow him. He looked worse under the ICU lighting than he had in the trauma bay, the color of a man who'd lost significant blood and was being rebuilt by transfusion and medication. But his eyes were clear, and when he saw Reed, he didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who'd been expecting a specific conversation and was relieved it was finally happening. "Commander?" His voice was hoarser than it had been, but functional. "How's the chest?" "Hurts. The nurse says that's good." He looked at Emily. "You're Carter." "Yes." "You did the decompression." Not a question. He looked at her with something uncomplicated and direct. The look of a man who knows he's alive because of a specific action by a specific person and has decided to be straightforward about it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, and pulled a chair to the bedside. "Tell me about Calloway." Vasquez looked at Reed. "She made Holt," Reed said. Vasquez closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. When he opened them, the expression was the one she was coming to recognize on both of them. The recalibration, the adjustment of a plan to new information. Callaway is not a person, Vasquez said. Or not just a person. It's the operational name for the Helion Group's procurement handler, the individual who manages the money flow between the military contractor side and the private intelligence buyers. We've had transaction records for 14 months. We had a voice match sample from an intercepted call in September. He paused for breath. The chest wound was costing him. The voice matched an active federal employee. We didn't know which one. Now you do, Emily said. If Holt made a call using that name, then yes. He pressed the heel of his hand against the bandaging over his ribs. Not dramatically, just the automatic management of a man tracking his own pain level. Holt's been running the Crestview operation for 8 months. If he's Callaway, then the operation was never intended to dismantle the network. It was damage control. The shape of it came clear to her then, the way a fracture becomes visible in an X-ray when you tilt the plate. Not new information, just the existing information arranged into its actual geometry. Holt managing the investigation to protect the network. Mercer identified as expendable, the node that could be sacrificed to satisfy the federal inquiry while the larger structure remained intact. The north exit, not a failure of containment, but a designed release valve. Mercer, believing he was escaping when he was actually being controlled, walked out of the building to a location where he could be managed rather than prosecuted. The files he recovered, she said. The ones from the maintenance corridor bag. Vasquez nodded carefully. In Holt's custody. So we have nothing. We have what I brought on that helicopter, Vasquez said. He looked at Reed again, a look that was asking a question. Reed answered it. Tell her. The CID investigation has been running parallel to FBI for 4 months. Independent server, air-gapped documentation, no shared access with Holt's team. Vasquez shifted, winced, steadied. I was transporting a forensic copy of the Helion Group financial architecture. The complete transaction ledger. 14 months of data, including account identifiers, transfer timestamps, and voice-tagged communications. Including, based on tonight, a voice that matches Holt. She looked at him. Where is it? Encrypted drive. I had it in my jacket when the helicopter went down. He paused. My jacket is somewhere in the trauma bay. She looked at Reed. Reed looked at the door. Petra, Emily said. Petra appeared in the doorway with the particular efficiency of someone who had been listening without apology. The personal effects from the trauma intake are in a locked bin in the equipment room. I need a medical reason to access it outside of standard protocol. His pain management requires adjustment, and I need to cross-reference his pre-existing medication documentation, which may be in his personal effects, Emily said. Petra looked at her. That's not a great reason. It's the reason I have. Petra left without further comment. The drive was there, a matte black encrypted storage unit, slightly larger than a thumb drive in the inner pocket of a jacket that smelled of aviation fuel and blood. Petra brought it to the bay without touching it more than necessary and handed it to Reed, who looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone holding something that has cost a significant amount to obtain. Getting it to the right people without going through Holt was the problem they spent the next 11 minutes solving in voices kept low enough that they didn't carry past the bay curtain. Vasquez knew a contact at the Army Inspector General's office, a deputy IG named Farrow, who had been quietly briefed on the parallel CID investigation and who had the authority and the independence to receive the evidence and act on it without going through FBI channels. The problem was time. The problem was also that Holt had Mercer in federal custody, somewhere in this building, and if Holt understood the drive existed, if Mercer told him, which Mercer would do if he was being managed rather than prosecuted, then the window to move the evidence was not long. Can Farrow get someone here tonight? Reed asked. Farrow can get someone here in 4 hours, maybe 3 if I call now. Vasquez looked at his hands. I can't make the call from a hospital room. They monitor the lines. Reed looked at Emily. She pulled out her phone. Personal device, personal carrier, not routed through the hospital system. She handed it to Vasquez. He looked at it, then at her. If this goes where it needs to go, he said, you're going to be in the middle of it. I've been in the middle of it for 6 years, she said. Make the call. He made the call. It was short. Under 2 minutes, the clipped language of people who have established protocols for exactly this kind of situation. When he handed the phone back, his face was tired in a way that went past the physical. 3 hours, he said. Pharaoh's sending a CID team. They'll come in as medical transport. Fort Aldrich has a standing authorization for patient transfers, so the vehicles won't raise flags. He paused. We need to hold the drive until they arrive, and we need Holt not to know the drive exists. This was the part Emily had already been thinking about. Holt would go back to the trauma bay. He would look at the property log from tonight's casualty intake. He was thorough. She'd read that in him within the first 10 minutes of conversation. He would find the jacket. He would find the empty inner pocket, and then he would start looking for what had been in it. We need to move it, she said. Not hide it. Move it. Where? She thought about the hospital's physical layout. The parts of it she knew from 14 months of navigation. Not just her floor, but the connective tissue of the building, the service corridors and equipment rooms and the places that were technically accessible but practically ignored. She thought about who else was in the building tonight. She thought about Petra. There's a medical equipment storage room on the second floor, she said. It's used for overflow respiratory equipment, ventilators, CPAP units, the kind of things that get cataloged and forgotten between uses. It's not on any monitoring system because the equipment itself is tracked by serial number, not location. I've been in there 3 times. That buys us time, Reed said. Not security. No, but it gets the drive out of this unit before Holt comes looking. She stood up. I'll move it. You stay with Vasquez. If Holt comes here, you're visiting a casualty you helped recover. That's a clean story. Reed looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize. It wasn't doubt exactly, more the look of a person recalibrating their assessment of another person's specific kind of capability. You've done this before, he said. Move things in hospitals? Yes. Usually it's medication carts. That's not what I mean. She picked up the drive. I know what you mean. She left. The second-floor storage room was where she remembered it, and the combination she remembered from when she'd checked out equipment during the East Wing renovation still worked. Maintenance had been meaning to update the keypad code since the previous fiscal year, according to a memo she'd read in September, and evidently no one had acted on. She put the drive inside a decommissioned CPAP unit behind the foam padding of the inner casing and closed the unit's case and put it back on the shelf between 2 identical units. She stood in the room for a moment in the dark. 3 hours. She needed Holt not to find the drive and not to find Vasquez's call log, and not to realize that his controlled operation had developed a significant leak. 3 hours of maintenance, of staying in sight, of being the cooperative witness who had been helpful and was continuing to be helpful and was not a threat. She was good at this. She had been doing a version of it for 6 years. She went back to the 3rd floor and found a chair near the nurse's station and sat down and waited, and at 2:47 a.m. Holt came through looking for her. He was good. She gave him that. There was nothing in his face that indicated urgency. He was still the controlled, neutral investigator, the competent professional managing a complex scene. He had Mercer processed, he said, transferred to the federal holding facility in Bremerton. Everything was moving as it should. He needed her available for a formal statement in the morning. Of course, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those assessing eyes. You did good work tonight, he said, with the casualties. I'm a nurse, she said. Right. He looked down the corridor. Get some rest if you can. We'll be in touch early. He left. She watched him go and thought about the account number, the voice, the name Calloway. She thought about 14 months of transactions in an encrypted drive in a decommissioned CPAP unit on the 2nd floor. She thought about 3 hours. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved. Pharaoh's team is 2 hours out. Problem. Holt filed a property transfer request 20 minutes ago. Personal effects from all tonight's casualties, consolidated to federal evidence custody. He has authorization from the hospital administrator. She read it twice. The property transfer. He was going to pull the jacket through official channels, and when the drive wasn't in it, he would know it had already been moved, and he would know someone had done it deliberately, and then the search would be specific and urgent rather than general. 2 hours. She was already standing. She was halfway to the stairwell when the hospital's overhead system came to life. Not an emergency tone, something different, a code she'd heard only twice in her career, used only in situations involving an active security threat to staff or patients. Code Silver. Armed individual in the building. She stopped. The overhead repeated, Code Silver, Sublevel 1. All staff shelter in place. Sublevel 1. Below the maintenance corridor. Below where Mercer had been taken. Below where the federal agents had been positioned. Sublevel 1 was where the hospital's auxiliary server room was. Where the building's internal communications were routed. Where, if you knew what you were doing and had the right access, you could pull the complete log of every phone call made from inside Crestview Medical Center in the last 24 hours, including a 2-minute call placed from an ICU patient's personal device to a number in Washington, D.C. She turned around and ran. The stairwell door hit the wall behind her, and she didn't slow down. Sublevel 1 was 2 floors below the ICU, and the fastest route was the service stairs at the east end of the building. The ones the maintenance staff used, narrow and poorly lit, and smelling of industrial cleaner. She took them fast, one hand on the rail, the other on her phone, texting Reed with her thumb as she moved. Code Silver Sub 1, server room. They found the call. She got to the sublevel 1 landing and stopped with her hand on the push bar of the door, listening. Nothing from the other side. The Code Silver announcement had pushed all non-security staff into shelter protocols, which meant the corridors down here should be clear. Should be, except for whoever had triggered the code. She pushed through. The corridor was empty. Fluorescent gray-green paint, the same palette as the floor above. She moved along the wall toward the server room at the far end. The door was closed. No sounds from inside. No visible light under the gap. She was 15 feet away when she heard the footsteps behind her. She turned. Holt came around the corner from the west stairwell at a pace that was controlled but faster than his earlier walk. Not running, but the walk of a man who had stopped performing calm and was moving toward a specific objective. He had his badge out, but not his weapon, and when he saw her, he stopped. They looked at each other across the corridor. "Ms. Carter," he said, "Code Silver is an active threat protocol. You should be on your floor." "So should you," she said. "Shouldn't you be managing the response?" Something moved across his face, a small recalibration, the expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion. He covered it quickly, but not quickly enough. "Walk back to the stairwell with me," he said. "Now." "The server room," she said. "That's what you're here for." He stepped forward. "I'm not going to ask again. You pulled a property transfer on the casualty intake from tonight. All of it. That's not standard procedure for a witness-based investigation." She kept her voice steady. She was not as steady as she sounded, but he didn't need to know that. "That's a cleanup procedure." Holt stopped moving. He looked at her with those controlled eyes, and the neutrality in his face had shifted into something else. Not anger, something cooler than anger, the assessment of a problem that needed to be reclassified. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Calloway?" she said. The corridor went very quiet. Holt's hand moved toward his jacket, not the badge side, the other side, and a voice from behind Emily said, "Don't." She turned. Reed was in the corridor, coming from the east, and he was not alone. Behind him, 2 men in civilian clothing with CID identification visible. Not Pharaoh's team, too fast for that, but the pins on their lapels were Army Criminal Investigation, and their posture was the posture of people who had been briefed and were ready. Holt looked at them. He looked at Reed. His hand dropped. "Commander Reed," he said, "you want to explain what this is?" CID has independent jurisdiction in matters involving active duty personnel and military assets, Reed said. Warrant Officer Vasquez filed a formal complaint 40 minutes ago citing conflict of interest in the current FBI operation. That complaint triggered a parallel authority review. He stopped 3 feet from Holt. "We're going to need your weapon and your credentials." The moment stretched. Holt was doing his calculation. Not panicking. She could see that. He was too trained for panic. But the calculation was visible in the set of his shoulders and the particular stillness of a man running through options and finding fewer of them than he'd expected. He handed over the weapon. He handed over the badge. He did it with the steadiness of a man who had not yet given up. And that was the part that made her skin go tight. Because a man who has given up hands things over with resignation, and Holt handed them over like a man buying time. The CID team secured Holt and moved him to a room off the main administrative corridor. Not a cell. The building didn't have cells, but a room with one door and a lock and an agent positioned outside. Reed stayed with him. Emily went back to the ICU to find Vasquez had already been told and was lying in the dark with the particular stillness of a man conserving energy for whatever came next. "The drive," he said when she came in. "Still in the storage room. Farrow's team is 90 minutes out." He shifted, pressed his hand to his ribs. Holt had a partner in the building, not in the FBI team, a civilian contractor attached to the Fort Aldrich Liaison Office. Name's Brennick. He came in with the federal response and nobody questioned it because he had credentials. She looked at him. "Where is he now?" "Unknown. He went dark when the code silver dropped." Vasquez looked at the ceiling. "He has clearance for the 4th floor. And he knows about the server room." "He's trying to pull the call log," she said, "or destroy it." She stood there for 2 seconds, weighing what she had against what she needed. She knew the hospital. Brennick didn't, or not as well. He was attached to the Fort Aldrich Liaison Office, which meant he knew the 4th floor, the administrative areas, the front-facing parts of the building. He would not know the service corridors as well as she did. He would not know which secondary stairwells had motion sensor gaps, because the East Wing renovation had left a section of the system partially uninstalled. He would not know that the server room had a secondary access point, a maintenance hatch through the adjacent electrical room used during the HVAC overhaul 18 months ago and never properly resecured. She knew these things because she had spent 14 months in this building and she paid attention, and she was a person who cataloged details the way some people catalog grievances, automatically, without specific intention, because you never knew which one would matter. "I know where he's going," she said, "and I know how to get there first." Vasquez looked at her. "Carter, you're a nurse." "I was a lot of things before I was a nurse," she said, and left. The electrical room adjacent to the server room was accessed through a door in the sub-level 1 corridor that was marked Authorized Personnel, electrical in red and white stenciling, and had a keypad lock that predated the hospital's current access system by approximately 8 years. The current system had a 6-digit code updated quarterly. This one had a 4-digit code that had been 2847 since before Emily had worked here, because the facilities manager had told her during the East Wing Advisory Committee that the older keypads weren't connected to the central credential system and nobody had gotten around to updating the access protocols. She put in 2847. The door opened. Inside, breaker panels, conduit, the low electrical smell of a room that runs hot, and on the far wall the maintenance hatch, a hinged access panel, roughly 2 feet square, that connected to the server room's crawl space. She'd seen it during a tour of the sub-level infrastructure, also during the advisory committee period, also courtesy of the facilities manager who had been proud of the hospital's mechanical systems, and not particularly cautious about who he showed them to. She went to the hatch and pulled it open as quietly as she could. On the other side, darkness, the hum of server equipment, and the sound of someone moving. She waited. She could see the ambient glow of server indicator lights through the crawl space. A shadow moved across the far wall. A person crouched over a terminal, working fast. The particular sound of a hard drive being accessed. The click and whir of a system under manual command. She needed to get to that terminal before whatever was on it disappeared. She went through the hatch. It was not graceful. The crawl space was 18 inches of clearance, and she scraped her shoulder going through and knocked her elbow on a cable conduit hard enough that her forearm went briefly numb. She came out the other side into the server room proper. Rows of black equipment towers, blue and green indicator lights, the contained cold of aggressive air conditioning. The man at the terminal was compact, 40-something, with the look of a person who worked in technical roles and had been underestimated his entire career for it. He heard her come through and turned. He was faster than she expected. He crossed the room in 2 steps and caught her arm before she reached the terminal, and the grip was not gentle. Fingers at the pressure point of the inside elbow, the specific hold of someone with combat training. He used her momentum and the room's tight layout to push her back against the server rack. "Walk out of here," he said. His voice was low and flat. "This doesn't involve you." It's involved me for 6 years," she said. She had one functional option at this angle and distance. She took it, dropped her weight straight down, the way her Army combatives instructor had demonstrated in a dusty training room at Fort Ramsey approximately 9 years ago, and used the shift to break the grip, and then she was out of his reach and between him and the door. He calculated the distance. She was blocking the door. The hatch was behind him. "Whatever you're deleting," she said, her breath coming harder than she'd like, "is already copied. Vasquez's CID team has 14 months of transaction data. The call logs here are evidence, not leverage." She kept her eyes on him. "You're not Calloway. You're not Holt. You're the technical layer, and the technical layer is always who they give up first." Something shifted in his face. "Walk to the door," she said. "Come out with me. Give the federal response team a complete account of your role, and cooperation gets you to a conversation. Going through that hatch gets you to a very different one." The server room hummed. The indicator lights did their indifferent blinking. Brennick put his hands up. Reed handled the handover. Emily stood against the far wall of the server room and watched 2 CID agents walk Brennick out, and when the room was empty except for herself and Reed, she sat down on the floor with her back against the server rack and stayed there for a moment without speaking. Reed looked at her. "You went through the maintenance hatch?" "Yes." "By yourself?" "You were with Holt." He crouched down so he was at eye level. "That was a significant risk." "A lot of tonight has been a significant risk." She looked at her hands. The elbow she'd knocked was going to bruise badly. Her shoulder felt like someone had run a cheese grater across it. "Is the terminal intact?" "The deletion was partial. He got maybe 30% of the call log before you came through." Reed looked at the terminal. "The CID team can work with what's left. Combined with Vasquez's drive, we have enough." "Enough for Holt?" "Enough for Holt. Enough for the network above him." He looked at her. "Calloway is a name in the transaction ledger tied to a specific account that is traceable to a senior partner in a federal contracting firm called Meridian Advisors. Holt was not the top. He was the operational handler. The money moved above him. She absorbed this. How many people? The transaction ledger documents payments to 11 individuals, military officers, 1 federal agent, Holt, and 4 private contractors. The Helion Group was the mechanism. Meridian Advisors was the architecture. Reed paused. And in 2019, a combat nurse at Fort Ramsey found a payment line in a disbursement audit that connected directly to the Meridian account. And instead of being protected, she was removed. She looked at the floor. At the server room's cold gray concrete, the cable management brackets, the industrial utility of a room nobody ever bothered to make comfortable because it wasn't meant for people. "I want to know whose decision that was," she said. "The discharge. I want a name." "You'll get one," Reed said. "Vasquez's team has already identified the officer who approved your medical discharge. He's in the transaction ledger." He paused. "Colonel Alden Price, Fort Ramsey commanding officer, 2018 to 2020. She said nothing. She sat with that name for a moment. Price had come to her unit once, a formal inspection, the kind where everyone stood straight and answered questions in the right order, and the commanding officer walked through looking at things without really seeing them. She'd seen him for approximately 4 minutes total. He had not looked at her at all. He had signed her discharge papers without, she suspected, thinking about her for more than the time it took to lift a pen. "He's in the ledger," she said. Payments from the Meridian account to a personal holding company in Nevada tied to Price's brother-in-law. 14 transactions over 3 years, beginning 6 months before your discharge. Reed's voice was level. "He didn't remove you because you were a liability. He removed you because he had already been paid not to look at things, and you were looking." She put her head back against the server rack, the cold metal against her neck, the hum of the equipment, steady and indifferent. She had spent 6 years constructing a careful narrative about what had happened to her. Not a self-pitying one. She didn't have the patience for self-pity, but a functional one. You were in the wrong place. You saw something inconvenient. Someone with more power made you go away. It was impersonal and institutional, and it was not about you specifically. She had told herself this because it was easier to carry than the alternative. The alternative was someone looked at your name on a piece of paper and signed it without looking up. Reed let the silence hold for a moment. Then, Farrow's team lands in 40 minutes. When they arrive, the drive gets into CID custody, and from there to the Inspector General's office. At that point, the investigation goes fully federal and fully documented, and there is nothing Holt or Meridian or Price or anyone else can do to it. He paused. We just need to hold 40 minutes. She got up. Her elbow ached, her shoulder was stiffening. She was operating on approximately 3 hours of sleep from the night before, and the kind of sustained adrenaline that left you feeling hollow when it eventually dropped. Fine, she said. Let's hold 40 minutes. 37 minutes later, in the hospital's main parking structure, 3 vehicles arrived with Fort Aldrich medical transport markings and disgorged a team of 8 CID agents and 1 civilian, Deputy Inspector General Linda Farrow, who was in her mid-50s and moved through the parking structure with the efficiency of a person who had been awakened at 2 a.m. and was treating it as a professional event rather than an imposition. Reed met them at the structure entrance. Emily stood back. She was not a formal part of this. She was a witness, a civilian, a fired nurse in a hospital she technically had no reason to be in, and she understood clearly that the procedural section of the night belonged to other people. Vasquez, when the CID team reached the ICU, insisted on being wheeled to the mobile command station in the parking structure rather than conducting the briefing from his bed, which Petra objected to on medical grounds, and he overrode on the grounds that this was not, technically, a medical decision. Petra looked at Emily. Emily lifted her hand slightly. Petra got the wheelchair. The handover of the drive happened with documentation she signed as a witness. 3 copies, 2 agents watching, the kind of bureaucratic formality that felt tedious and was in fact the most important thing that happened in the parking structure that night, because the chain of custody was the thing that would make everything else unassailable in whatever proceedings followed. Farrow reviewed the drive's contents on a secured tablet. She reviewed Vasquez's documentation of the parallel investigation. She reviewed the server room incident report that Reed had filed 20 minutes prior. She asked Emily 3 questions, all of them factual, and wrote the answers down. Then she made a phone call. Emily didn't hear the call. She was on the other side of the mobile unit, sitting in a folding chair someone had produced from somewhere, with a cup of coffee that was considerably better than the vending machine version and tasted like the specific kindness of someone thinking ahead. Petra, she suspected. When Farrow came back, her expression was the expression of a bureaucratic professional who has just been given authorization to move forward on something she has been building toward for a long time and is not going to show how she feels about it because the work isn't done. Federal arrest warrants are being prepared for Special Agent Dorian Holt, Garrett Brennick, and 6 additional individuals identified in the transaction ledger, Farrow said. I'm authorizing the immediate suspension of the FBI's Crestview operation and a full review of its conduct over the past 8 months. She paused. Wade Mercer's transfer to the Bremerton facility is being intercepted. He'll be remanded to CID custody for independent processing. Reed looked at Emily. She looked at the parking structure ceiling, concrete, rebar shadows, the fluorescent blue-white of the overhead panels. She thought about Mercer, the cardboard box, the smile. She thought about Price, who hadn't looked up. What about the accusations against Carter? Reed asked. Farrow looked at Emily with the direct, assessing look of a woman who forms opinions quickly and doesn't revise them lightly. The source of the leak to the press was an unnamed senior hospital administrator. Based on tonight's evidence, we can identify that administrator as Mercer, and the leak as deliberate witness intimidation. She paused. The nursing board will be formally notified that the termination and the press report were generated by an individual now in federal custody. Ms. Carter's license is not in question. Not in question. 14 words that covered 6 years and a cardboard box and the sound of a parking lot at 11:15 in the morning. She didn't say anything. Farrow moved on because there were other things to move on to, and that was correct. The work was not done, and it didn't stop for anyone's processing time. Emily sat in the folding chair and drank the coffee and let the next hour happen around her. Agents moving, documentation being transferred, communications going out on channels she wasn't cleared for. At some point, Reed came and sat in the adjacent folding chair. They sat without talking for a while, which was the right call. Price, she said eventually. In the warrant batch, Reed said. She nodded. The military record, she said. My discharge, can that be? Vasquez says yes. The IG office has authority to recommend formal review of administrative separations connected to documented misconduct. It's a process. It takes time. He looked at her. But yes. She thought about time. She had been thinking about time in the wrong direction for 6 years, looking backward, calculating the distance between what had happened and where she stood. It occurred to her, in the folding chair in the parking structure with the coffee growing cold in her hands, that the distance was fixed now. It couldn't grow anymore. Whatever happened next would be in a different direction. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. It didn't feel like relief exactly. It felt like the specific sensation of setting something down that you've been carrying so long you'd stop noticing the weight and becoming aware of your own hands. At 5:20 a.m., as the sky beyond the parking structure entrance went from black to the gray-purple of very early morning, Farrow's team began the formal arrest processing of Holt and Brennick. Emily was not present for the arrest itself. She was in the 4th-floor corridor, back on the quiet floor, the first time since the night this had started, sitting on a bench outside the records room, whose door was now propped open, and inside which 3 forensic agents were documenting the state of the filing system that Mercer had partially emptied. She was there because one of the forensic agents had asked her to confirm a point of reference about the physical condition of the door when she'd seen it 2 nights ago. And after she'd confirmed it, the agent had gone back inside and she'd sat down and hadn't gotten up yet. A door opened at the far end of the corridor. Footsteps. A single pair, not rushed. It was Dr. Storch, the trauma attending. She was in street clothes, off shift apparently, or ending one. She saw Emily and paused, then came toward her with the particular directness of a person who decides things quickly. I heard some of what happened tonight, Storch said. Not all of it, but enough. She stood in front of the bench. The chest decompression on Vasquez, the intake coordination, that wasn't field training from a nursing certification program. No, Emily said. FOB Kandahar. And Fort Ramsey. And a year at Walter Reed before that. Storch looked at her for a moment. I'm going to need a formal incident report from you on the trauma response. For the record. She paused. And I'm going to be making a recommendation to the board about clinical staffing. That's a separate conversation, but I want to have it. Emily looked at her. I was terminated. By an administrator who is currently in federal custody. Storch's voice was dry, precise. I think we can work with that? She started to leave, then stopped. Vasquez's vitals have been stable for 2 hours. The chest tube is doing what it's supposed to. She looked back. You made the right call every time tonight. That's not common. She left. Emily sat in the corridor with the sounds of the forensic team working behind the open door and the sky outside the window at the end of the hall going incrementally lighter, the specific shade of a morning that arrives later than you expected. She was still sitting there when the news vans started arriving in the parking lot below. She could see them from the corridor window. 2 local affiliates first, then a satellite truck she didn't recognize, and then a 4th vehicle with national network markings. Someone had called someone. The story was getting out in the way that stories do, chaotically and imperfectly, and faster than anyone's ability to shape it. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she'd been given 40 minutes ago. Farrow's direct line. Press statement at 0900. Your name will be included as a protected witness and cooperating civilian. No interviews required, but your presence at the briefing is requested. She looked at the message for a moment. She looked out the window at the news vans. Her name in a press statement. After the night spent as a named suspect in a leak designed to destroy her credibility. She was typing back an acknowledgement when the second text arrived, from the same number. One other thing. During processing, Holt provided a statement. He claims the Meridian operation has a component we haven't identified. A secondary data channel used to move intelligence summaries, not financial records, actual field intelligence, outside the standard contractor system. He says it was operational as of 48 hours ago. She read it twice. He says the channel runs through Crestviews medical records system. Patient data, modified. Used as a carrier for encoded information. She stood up. The encoding key, the text continued, was held by one person in the building, not Mercer, not Brennick. She was already moving toward the records room door. We're trying to identify who. Holt won't say. He's using it as leverage. Inside the records room, the forensic team was working methodically through filing cabinets and document boxes. One of the agents looked up when she came in. "The medical records system," she said. "Your forensic team, do they have access to the patient records database?" The agent looked at her cautiously. "That's a separate system. We'd need—" "Farrow," Emily said. "Call Farrow, right now. Tell her the encoding key isn't in those files." She looked at the room, at the open cabinets, at the carefully documented absent folders. "It's in the system, and I know who had access to it." She turned and walked back into the corridor. She pulled up the hospital directory on her phone and looked for the name she'd just thought of, the name that had been sitting at the edge of the night's events without resolving into significance until this moment. The administrator who had signed off on her termination, not Mercer, who had initiated it. The second signature on the termination paperwork, required by hospital policy. The co-signing administrator whose name she had read and filed away and not thought about again because she'd had other things to think about. She found the name. She stared at it. Then she looked up the office location and started walking. The name on the termination paperwork was Diane Collar, Associate Director of Clinical Operations, Crestview Medical Center. The second signature, the co-signing administrator, the person whose name Emily had read in under a second on the morning she'd been handed a box and escorted to an elevator. She hadn't thought about it because she'd been thinking about Mercer, about the cardboard box, about the security breach. She hadn't thought about it because the second signature was procedural, required by hospital policy, the institutional equivalent of a witness signature, the kind of name you see and register and file without analysis. She was thinking about it now. She was thinking about it because Diane Collar had been at Crestview for 9 years, because Diane Collar had been the administrator who approved the Fort Aldrich Liaison Office renovation on the 4th floor 2 years ago, who had signed off on the access system installation, who had been the hospital's primary point of contact for the Fort Aldrich contract since its inception. She had been in every meeting that mattered, had signed every document that opened every door. She had also, Emily now recalled, been on the 4th floor twice in the week before the breach. Emily had seen her there. The first time, noted it without significance. The second time, the day before the breach, also noted without significance. 2 data points that individually meant nothing and together meant something she should have seen earlier. Collar's office was on the 2nd floor, East Wing. Emily moved through the corridor with the specific purposefulness of someone who has stopped second-guessing her own instincts for the night. It was almost 5:40 a.m. The hospital was operating on the odd hybrid rhythm of an institution that had been in crisis mode for hours and was beginning, reluctantly, to approximate normalcy. The night staff were still present. The day shift was beginning to arrive, navigating the federal vehicles in the parking lot and the news vans on the street with visible unease. She texted Reed, "Collar, Associate Director, 2nd floor East. Go." She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. The East Wing administrator offices were behind a glass partition, private but not sealed, accessible from the main corridor through a door that required a staff badge. She used hers. It still worked. She walked past 3 empty offices and stopped outside the 4th. The light was on. She tried the handle. Unlocked. Diane Collar was at her desk. She was a woman of about 52, put together in the way of someone who has spent decades making sure she was never the person in the room who could be dismissed on appearance. She dressed precisely and moved deliberately and had the quiet operational competence of someone who understood that visibility in institutions is a double-edged thing. You want to be seen doing the right things, and you want to be invisible doing the rest. She looked up when Emily opened the door. Something in her face, not shock, she was too composed for shock, but a specific recalibration, a rapid internal adjustment. "Miss Carter," she said. "Director Collar." Emily came into the office and closed the door. She didn't sit. "The medical record system, the encoding protocol. How long?" Collar looked at her for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the desk. The desk was very tidy. The desk of someone who clears things away before they become visible. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Her voice was professionally even. Holt told the CID team about the secondary data channel. He called it leverage. Emily looked at her. It's not leverage if the channel is already identified, which it will be within the hour once the forensic team gets into the medical records database. Caller's eyes moved. A small shift, lateral, the tell of a person running an internal calculation. The channel runs through the patient records system, Emily said. Modified data fields, used as a carrier for encoded intelligence summaries. That kind of system modification requires administrator-level access, not liaison office access. Hospital system access. She paused. That's you. The office was very quiet. Outside the glass partition, the corridor was empty except for the distant movement of the day shift beginning its arrival. Caller looked at her hands, then at Emily. I want an attorney, she said. That's correct, Emily said, and the people who are going to be here in about 3 minutes can facilitate that. She didn't move. Before they arrive, I want to ask you something, not for the investigation, for me. Caller waited. The termination, the paperwork. You signed it. Emily kept her voice even, because this was the part where even was important. Did you know what Mercer was doing when you signed it? Did you know he was setting me up? The question sat in the room. Caller looked at the desk surface. I knew you'd seen something, she said finally. I didn't know the details. But you signed it anyway. A pause. Yes. Emily looked at her. She absorbed this, the specific texture of it, the way it was worse than malice in certain respects, because it was pragmatism. Because someone had decided that Emily Carter's career and reputation and 6 additional years of displacement were an acceptable operational cost, and had signed the paperwork without needing to know the details. The same thing Price had done at Fort Ramsey. Not hate, not fear, not even greed specifically, just a calculation. A pen lifted, a name signed, a person made to go away. The door opened behind Emily. Reed came in with a CID agent she'd seen earlier, and behind them, moving with the authority of someone whose jurisdiction had just expanded significantly, was Farrow. Emily stepped to the side. She watched Farrow cross the room to Caller's desk and read the formal statement with the steady, practiced cadence of a bureaucratic professional for whom this moment was not personal, was entirely procedural, was simply the next step in a documented process that had been building for months and was now arriving at its natural conclusion. She watched Caller stand. She watched the CID agent secure Caller's workstation. She watched the beginning of the end of the architecture that had been running beneath Crestview Medical Center like a second electrical system, invisible, load-bearing, illegal, for years. Then she walked out of the office because she had done her part, and what came next was not her job, and she needed to sit down. The press briefing at 9 a.m. was held in the hospital's main conference room, which had been configured with a speaker's table at the front and approximately 40 chairs, most of which were full. Representatives from CID, the FBI's oversight division, different from Holt's field office, specifically the division charged with reviewing that field office's conduct, the Inspector General's office, and the hospital's board were at the front. Journalists from 4 outlets sat in the rows. Hospital staff, some still in scrubs from the night shift, stood along the back wall. Emily sat in the second row. Reed was beside her. Petra was 3 seats to his left, still in her scrubs, having apparently decided that her shift technically ended whenever this ended. Farrow spoke first. She was concise and factual because she was Farrow, and she delivered the outline of the investigation's findings with the same steady professionalism she brought to everything. A coordinated corruption network operating across military procurement and private intelligence sale, facilitated through the Helion Group and the Meridian Advisors firm, with nodes inside Fort Aldrich, the FBI's Crestview field operation, and Crestview Medical Center's administrative structure. 8 individuals in federal custody, 14 indictments pending, asset freezes on 6 corporate entities. She said Emily Carter's name twice in the briefing, once in the context of the initial breach report, the report that had been suppressed and weaponized against her, once in the context of the evidence recovery, both times factually, without embellishment. Factual was enough. The Army CID representative spoke after Farrow. He was a colonel named Weston, career officer, sparse in the way of career officers who have learned that words are ammunition and you can serve them. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He covered the parallel CID investigation, the transaction ledger, Warrant Officer Vasquez's operation, and the identification of Colonel Alden Price as a documented participant in the Meridian Payment Network. Then he said, "The CID is initiating a formal review of administrative separations connected to identified misconduct within the scope of this investigation. Specifically, the 2019 medical discharge of former Army combat nurse Emily Carter has been flagged for immediate review. Preliminary examination of the documentation indicates the discharge was initiated under false pretenses and approved by a commanding officer currently under federal indictment." The room shifted, a collective movement, a reorientation of attention. Heads turned, journalists wrote things down. Emily looked at her hands in her lap. 6 years, 2 months, and some number of days since the discharge papers had been handed to her in a Fort Ramsey administrative office by a clerk who'd had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. She had read the reasons cited, stress-related performance impairment, and she had held the papers, and she had not argued because she had understood by then that argument was not a tool available to her. She had taken the papers. She had rebuilt from them. She hadn't expected this moment to feel like this. She had imagined it, occasionally, in the first year. The scene of vindication, the formal acknowledgement, the explicit correction of the record. She had stopped imagining it after a while because imagining things you can't control is a particular kind of self-inflicted injury. So she had not prepared for the way it actually felt, which was quieter and more complicated and more physical than she'd expected. A tightness in the chest, the kind that was not pain but was pressure, the sensation of something structural adjusting. Reed put his hand briefly on her forearm. Not a squeeze, not a gesture of comfort particularly, just a placement, a point of contact. She was aware of it, and it helped. After the formal statements, questions from journalists, Emily didn't speak. She had been advised that she wasn't required to, and she had taken that advice without debate, because she had things she needed to think through before she said them out loud to cameras. The question that hit hardest was the one she'd expected least. A journalist from the Harlow Courier, so local paper, young reporter, the kind of person who'd ended up in a mid-sized Montana city, straight out of J school, and was covering a story that was going to define their career, asked, "Was there any point where someone could have caught this sooner? Any point where the system should have protected the whistleblower instead of removing her?" The room went quiet in a specific way. Farrow answered carefully, in the institutional language of someone who knows the question is a trap and is navigating its edges. Reed said nothing. Weston looked at the table. Emily thought about 2019, about a supervisor taking a printout from her hands, about the word misread, about the transfer, the discharge, the 3 weeks in between during which she had still believed, despite everything, that the inquiry would find what she'd found and the outcome would correct itself. She had not raised her hand. She was not going to speak to a room full of journalists and cameras at 9 a.m. after an overnight in which she had crawled through a maintenance hatch and confronted a federal agent in a sub-level corridor and sat on a parking structure floor with cold coffee. But she thought about the answer, and the answer was yes. There were 100 points where the system could have caught it sooner. There were 100 individual people who had small pieces of information and didn't connect them, who had questions and didn't ask them, who had the option to look and chose not to. She was one of them. She had walked past that door twice before the night she stopped. She had seen caller on the 4th floor and filed it as unremarkable. She had stayed quiet for 14 months because quiet had felt like safety. The system didn't protect her. But the system was also not a monolith. It was a collection of people making choices. Vasquez had been running a parallel investigation for 4 months because he'd made a choice to look. Petra had handed her the decompression needle without being asked because she was paying attention. Reed had been searching for her for years because someone had decided the injustice was worth the effort. The system had failed her, and parts of the system had eventually come for her. Both things were true. At 11 a.m., in the parking structure, as the federal vehicles began the process of organized departure, and the news vans repositioned for afternoon coverage, Vasquez was brought down in his wheelchair for transfer to the Fort Aldrich Medical Facility. He looked like a man who'd been in a helicopter crash, which he had, and also like a man who'd closed a file he'd been carrying for a long time, which he had. He found Emily near the structure entrance. "The ledger is in IG custody," he said, "fully authenticated, all 14 transaction sets." He looked at her. "Price's indictment is being filed this afternoon. His attorney has already contacted the IG office. He'll cooperate." "They always cooperate," she said, "when the documents exist." "Yes." He looked at her. "For what it's worth, the CID review of your discharge. It's a process, like Reed said. 3 to 4 months for the preliminary findings, possibly 6 for the full recommendation." He paused. "But Weston has already been briefed on the specific circumstances. He's seen the 2019 audit records, the payment timeline, the discharge documentation. He doesn't need to be convinced." She nodded. "Carter." He leaned forward slightly in the wheelchair, which the effort cost him. "What you found in 2019, at a desk, on a base, as a combat nurse doing a routine audit cross-reference, that was the thread. Everything we built in 14 months, the transaction ledger, the Helion trace, the Meridian architecture. It all starts from a payment line you identified in a disbursement record that your supervisor told you you'd misread." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't misread it." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it out loud anyway because it should be said out loud." She looked at him. He was right that it should be said out loud. She was going to hold on to the fact that it had been that a CID warrant officer had said it to her in a parking structure at 11 a.m. with a chest tube and federal documentation and the specific authority of a person who'd staked 4 months of his career on its truth. She held out her hand. He shook it. His transport team came and took him, and she watched the wheelchair navigate the parking structure's incline and disappear into the morning light. And then she turned around. Reed was leaning against the concrete pillar behind her. "What happens now?" she said. "For the investigation, about 6 months of federal proceedings. The network is dismantled, but dismantling takes paperwork." He pushed off the pillar. "For Mercer, he's already negotiating. He'll give up Meridian's principles in exchange for reduced exposure. He'll get something in the range of 12 to 15 years, which sounds like less than it is for a man his age. Holt will fight it. He has lawyers, and he has the instinct of someone who's been in federal systems his whole career and knows how to use procedural delay. But the ledger is clean, and the evidence chain is clean, and he doesn't have a version of this that ends well for him." Reed paused. "Price is the one who'll cooperate most fully, because Price is exactly the kind of person who spends his career making decisions that protect himself, and will spend the rest of it doing the same thing." "And Caller?" "The encoding system she built into the medical records platform is, apparently, technically sophisticated. The forensic team is surprised by it." He said it without admiration, just fact. "She'll face obstruction, conspiracy, and illegal intelligence distribution charges. The hospital board is holding an emergency session this afternoon." Emily looked at the parking structure entrance, the rectangle of Montana morning beyond it, pale blue, the mountains still in cloud shadow, the street where the news vans had been thinning out. "Storch wants to talk to me," she said. "I heard. About a clinical position." "I know." She looked at him. "There's something else." He waited. "The IG office. Farrow mentioned, before the briefing, that there's a program, a military medical advisory panel being assembled, specifically for trauma care standards in forward operating environments. The person they had lined up to consult pulled out last month." She paused. "She asked if I'd be interested in a preliminary conversation." Reed looked at her for a moment. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She looked at the entrance. "I've been a nurse for 6 years. A good one. That's not nothing." "No, it's not. But I was also something before that. And they took that from me without asking, and without—" She stopped, started again. "Nobody asked what I wanted to do in 2019. They just decided what was convenient and signed it. I spent 6 years working around what they decided." She looked at him directly. "I'd like to decide something myself." Reed nodded slowly. "What are you deciding?" She thought about the storage room on the second floor, the The drive in the CPAP unit. She thought about the maintenance hatch and the cold floor of the server room and Brennick's grip on her arm in the specific moment she'd dropped her weight and broken free. She thought about the decompression needle and Vasquez's color coming back and the sound of his sat rising on the monitor. She thought about the list she'd made at her kitchen table 2 nights ago, before all of this, when she'd thought the problem was just the termination and the leak and a job she needed to recover. Both, she said. I want both. Reed looked at her. Then something in his face that had been professionally contained for most of the night, the control of a man operating in a high-stakes environment where readable emotion is a liability, shifted just slightly into something warmer and less managed. Good, he said. But 3 weeks later, a formal military recognition ceremony was held at Fort Aldrich. It was not a large ceremony. The Army is not reflexively inclined toward spectacle, and the circumstances of what was being recognized were complicated enough that spectacle would have been the wrong register. It was held in the post's main assembly hall, rows of chairs, an elevated platform, a podium, approximately 200 people, officers, veterans from the region, hospital staff. Petra was there, in civilian clothes, sitting in the 4th row. Dr. Storch was there. Vasquez was there, still moving carefully, the chest wound 3 weeks into healing, which was functional but not finished. Reed was on the platform. Emily stood at the podium and looked out at the room and tried to remember the last time she had stood at a podium in front of any number of people, and the answer was that she hadn't. Not since Fort Ramsey, not since before, and even then it had been a unit briefing and not this. Brigadier General Carolyn Mast, who commanded the region's Army Medical Oversight Division, presented the commendation. She read the citation in full, which took 4 minutes and covered the 2019 audit finding, the subsequent unjust discharge, the events of 3 weeks prior at Crestview Medical Center, and the formal reversal of the medical separation under the IG's recommendation. She used the word courage twice, and the phrase exceptional service under compromised circumstances once, and those were both accurate and Emily accepted them as such. The commendation was a physical document in a formal frame, heavier than she expected when Mast handed it to her. The frame's glass caught the overhead lights and threw a small reflection across the front row of seats. She shook Mast's hand. She shook Weston's hand, who had made the drive from the CID regional office and was the kind of man who does what he said he would do and doesn't announce it. She looked out at the room. She hadn't prepared remarks because she didn't trust prepared remarks. They had a way of becoming the thing you were trying to say, rather than the thing you actually meant. And she had spent enough of the last 6 years being managed and curated and officially characterized that she was not interested in doing it to herself. So she stood at the podium and held the commendation and said what she actually meant. I did a routine audit cross-reference in the spring of 2019, and I found something I wasn't supposed to find, she said. And I reported it to someone I trusted because that was what you were supposed to do. And he took the printout from my hands and told me I'd misread it and sent me back to my unit. She paused. I hadn't misread it. I want that on the record in this room with this many witnesses, clearly and without qualification. I had not misread it. The room was quiet. I spent 6 years rebuilding, not recovering, rebuilding, which is different, because recovering implies there's something waiting for you intact on the other side. There wasn't. I built something different. I got good at a version of my job that was smaller than what I'd trained for, and I told myself that was fine, because the alternative was continuing to want something I'd been told I couldn't have. She looked at the frame in her hands. 3 weeks ago, someone in a sub-level corridor tried to tell me to walk away from something I'd seen. And I didn't, because I'm not 28 anymore, and I have run out of the particular patience that walking away requires. A sound in the room, not laughter exactly, but the human sound of recognition. I'm not going to tell you the system worked, she said. It didn't in 2019. People in this room know better than I do how many versions of what happened to me don't end the way this did. People get discharged and don't get vindicated. People report things and the report disappears and nothing follows it. She looked up from the frame. I got lucky, in some specific ways. I had Vasquez running a parallel track. I had Reed. I had people who'd been building something for 14 months before I walked into it. She paused. And I had the fact that I'd remembered the name, that I'd held on to what I'd seen in 2019 and not let them convince me I'd misread it. That's the only part that was entirely mine. She looked out at Petra, who was watching her with that dark-eyed steadiness. At Storch, who had the expression of a person filing something for future reference. At Vasquez, who had his hands loosely folded in his lap and his posture of a man who has made peace with the cost of doing a thing correctly. There's a clinical position here that I'm going to take, she said. And there's an advisory role in military medical protocol that I'm also going to take, because apparently I'm not finished with that part of things either. She looked down at the commendation one more time. I want to say thank you to the people who looked when they could have chosen not to. That choice is the whole thing, not the system, not the institution, the individual choice to look. She stepped back from the podium. The room stood up, not in the performative, automatic way that rooms stand, but incrementally, the way a standing ovation actually happens, which is person by person, each one making a choice, until the whole room is on its feet and the sound of it is not applause exactly, but something larger than applause, something that fills the assembled hall in a way she hadn't anticipated, and that she was not going to let herself dismiss as mere ceremony. She stood and held the frame and let it be real. Later, after the formal portion had dissolved into the informal, people standing in groups, coffee from a side table, the lower register sound of a room talking rather than listening, Reed found her near the hall's east windows. Outside, the mountains had cleared. The sky was the hard, saturated blue that Montana produces in October when the cloud systems break and the light comes down at the right angle. And the range to the west was sharp-edged and clean and very large. The advisory program, he said. Farrow wants to know by end of month. She'll have an answer by end of week. He looked at her. And Storch? Monday. First day? She looked at the mountains. I'm going to be terrible at being supervised. You'll manage. I was fired 3 weeks ago for insubordination, more or less. You were fired 3 weeks ago by a man who is currently negotiating a plea agreement while his lawyers try to reduce a federal conspiracy charge. He paused. Different context. She almost smiled. Different context. Outside, the light was doing the thing it does at altitude in autumn, arriving at a low angle, making ordinary things look deliberate. The parking lot, the post's administrative buildings, the flag at the main entrance, moving in whatever wind was coming off the range. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago, sitting in her car in a gas station parking lot, listening to a radio broadcast about a security incident at a hospital she'd just been walked out of. That woman had been very tired, had been carrying something heavy for 6 years without being fully conscious of its weight, had believed, not optimistically, but as a matter of functional survival, that the record would stay wrong forever, that the printout she'd found and lost and spent 6 years knowing she hadn't misread would remain unverified because the alternative required someone with authority to choose to look. She thought about all the things that had to happen to get from that gas station parking lot to this room. The helicopter crash. Vasquez choosing to transfer his evidence on that flight. The maintenance hatch. Brennick's hand on her arm and the drop of weight that broke the grip. Reed standing in the north exit with his boots muddy, and 3 Navy SEALs in the rain. And before all of it, a routine audit cross-reference in the spring of 2019, a payment line she was supposed to pass, a moment she had chosen to stop and look. That was where it had actually begun. Not in the sub-level corridor, not in the server room, not even in the 4th-floor hallway with the door standing 3 inches open. It had begun with a woman at a desk who had not convinced herself she'd misread something she'd read correctly, and who had held on to that specific, inconvenient knowledge across 6 years of being told it didn't exist. You cannot take that from a person. You can take their job, their record, their rank, their career trajectory, their confidence in the systems that were supposed to protect them. You can take a lot, but you cannot reach into someone and remove the knowledge of what they actually saw. That was the thing they hadn't counted on. That was the thread Vasquez had said everything else began from. She had kept it because she had no choice. She had not been heroic about it. She had been stubborn and a little isolated and more tired than she let on, and she had gotten through it the way you get through most things. Not by being extraordinary, but by not stopping. Reed was still beside her at the window. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at the mountains. "That I want to go home," she said, "and sleep for about 12 hours, and then I want to start." He nodded. She picked up her jacket from the chair behind her. She held the commendation under her arm, heavier than it looked, solid, with the weight of something official and permanent and corrective. She walked toward the exit of the assembly hall, and people moved aside for her, and some of them nodded, and some of them said her name, and she moved through all of it the way she'd learned to move through hard things, not by pretending it was easy, but by being present for it. She walked out into the October light. Behind her, in the assembly hall, the sound of the room continued. Conversations, the particular hum of people processing something that had shaken loose their understanding of what institutions could do and what individuals inside them could survive. Ahead of her, the mountains stood where they always had, indifferent and enormous and genuinely beautiful in the kind of way that doesn't require your acknowledgement. She had a position starting Monday, an advisory conversation at end of week, a parking lot to cross, a car to get into, an apartment to return to, and a life that was not the life she'd had before, not the rebuilt version either, but something that didn't have a name yet because it was new. She was 37 years old. She was not finished. The woman they had quietly removed from a desk in 2019 because she'd seen something she was supposed to miss. The woman they had handed a box to and escorted to an elevator, who had driven 3 blocks before pulling over to listen to the radio, who had crawled through a hospital maintenance hatch at 3 a.m. on a shoulder that was now going to bruise magnificently, who had stood at a podium and said out loud, with witnesses, that she had not misread it, was walking into the October morning with her commendation under her arm and her eyes forward. Some things, once you have looked at them directly, cannot be made to disappear. She had looked. She had held on. And in the end, that was the only thing that had needed to be true.